This video will focus primarily on the vertebrae, part of the axial skeleton. Okay, so here's the entire axial skeleton in this image. A good majority of it is the skull, and that's all up here. That was talked about in a separate video. This video is going to focus on the vertebrae themselves. Now, when dealing with vertebrae, they are broken into several regions. First of all are what are called cervical vertebrae. They are in the neck region. There are 7 of those, and there are 7 cervical vertebrae in all critters. It doesn't matter if you're a snake or a giraffe, a human, or something like a mouse. Long neck, short neck, doesn't matter. We all have 7 cervical vertebrae. The next chunk of vertebrae are referred to as thoracic vertebrae. The number of thoracic vertebrae can vary from species to species. Humans have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and every thoracic vertebrae is hooked up to a pair of ribs, which means altogether humans have 24 ribs. Something like a snake may have hundreds of thoracic vertebrae and hundreds of ribs as a result. So that number can vary from species to species, as can the number of lumbar vertebrae. Now, the lumbar vertebrae are the vertebrae of the lower back region. Humans have 5. Some animals like rabbits may have 7 or 6 or whatever. So that number can vary. This image does not show the sacrum very well. The sacrum is down, kind of embedded in the middle of the pelvis, and the coccyx is below that. The coccyx is what we refer to as the tailbone in most of us. This image shows a comparison of a cervical vertebrae, a thoracic vertebrae, and a lumbar vertebrae. Cervical vertebrae have this basic appearance here. They tend to be kind of light looking, kind of frail. You'll notice that they have a large hole in the middle, as do all these vertebrae. That hole is referred to as the vertebral foramen. It's where the spinal cord goes. But you'll also notice that in the cervical region there are extra holes here and here. In those extra holes, let me make the scribbles go away. Those extra holes are for blood vessels and such, and that is something that every cervical vertebrae has, and they are called transverse foramen, and only cervical vertebrae have those transverse foramen. Now, this term transverse process here, the process refers to these bumps on the side, and you'll see that this is common on every vertebrae. We have transverse processes sticking out the sides of everything. The term spinous process is going to refer to Spinous process is going to be the bump that sticks out the top, and every vertebrae has that. These spines stick straight out dorsally off the back of a person, and this is what gives the spinal column its name. It is a column of those particular spines. Another feature every vertebrae has is something called the vertebral body, and that is the weight-bearing part of the vertebrae. And you'll notice that as we work down from cervical to thoracic to lumbar, that those vertebral bodies get bigger. And that makes sense when you consider that by the time you get lower down, you are supporting more weight. Okay? The sacrum is comprised of 5 bones that have been fused together. So the sacrum starts here and ends here. We have bone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. When you're very young, those are 4 separate bones. But about the time you're up and around and walking, and you're like elementary age and so on, that has fused into one large bone. And then down here we have our coccyx, which is anywhere from 3 to 5 separate bones that have been fused together. This is an image looking kind of from an inferior view up into the rib cage. This is the natural bone. And when you look way up here, you can see up at the top, you can see some cervical vertebrae up there. Then there's a stretch where you can see quite nicely the thoracic vertebrae all through here. And you'll see that the thoracic vertebrae have ribs attached coming out both sides. All thoracic vertebrae have that. And then you can see the lumbar vertebrae. In the lumbar vertebrae, again, there are 5 of them, so there's 5, 4, 3, 2, and actually this one here would be lumbar number 1. It's an optical illusion. Those ribs are actually attached higher up. So the lumbar vertebrae are quite easily seen. And then down here we have our sacrum, and you can see where it's attached to the pelvis, here and here. Here we focus on the cervical vertebrae. Every cervical vertebrae has this extra set of holes on the side. These extra holes are called transverse foramen. And that is true of every cervical vertebrae, and it's only true of cervical vertebrae. Now, every vertebrae, whether it's cervical or otherwise, has this thing called a transverse foramen, which is this bump on the sides. And you can see it here and here. You can see it here and here. You can see one here, here. Transverse process. Process is a bump. Foramen is a hole. The term vertebral body is always going to refer to the weight-bearing part of the vertebrae, which is here. In this vertebrae, which is called the atlas, it's only going to be holding up the head, so it doesn't have much of a vertebral body. And by the way, it's called atlas because it's named after the Greek god Atlas that held the world up on his shoulder. This other one here with this pivot point sticking out the top is called the axis, and that little point of rotation there, the name of that little bump is called the dens, and it is the pivot point that allows you to turn your head right and left. You can see here that the atlas and axis fit together quite nicely. On top is the atlas, and below it is the axis. And think of the axis as, again, having this pivot point that allows you to turn your head right and left. You'll notice on the atlas that there is like a little depression here and here, and those depressions fit onto the occipital condyles on the skull, and that's what allows you to nod your head up and down, whereas the pivot point right in here allows you to turn your head right and left. So those things fit together just like that. This is a close-up of the thoracic vertebrae. When you look at the thoracic vertebrae, one of the most noticeable things is the spinous process. All vertebrae have this, but the spinous process on thoracic vertebrae is very, very large and sticks out prominently. If you run your fingers down the middle of someone's back, you can feel these things sticking out quite nicely in the region of the shoulder blades. The transverse process also exists, and in the case of the transverse process, in a vertebrae, we have something referred to as the facet for the rib in here, and that's going to be a little splotch here, which translates to here, and another one near the body, and this is a place where the rib will attach. If I include a rib in this image, the rib would kind of hook around something like this, attaching to the vertebrae about here and about there. The vertebral body, again, is the weight-bearing part of the vertebrae, and they get progressively larger as you work down the thoracic vertebrae. And we also have our articular facets, or facets as they're pronounced. The superior facet is here on the top of the vertebrae, and then just under here is the inferior facet. So this is the superior facet and the inferior facet, and this is where vertebrae would attach above and below this vertebrae. Every vertebrae has both. The superior facet of this vertebrae would hook to the inferior facet of the next vertebrae above it. This is a typical lumbar vertebrae. Key feature of a lumbar vertebrae that's very worth noting is how large the vertebral body is. On these things, the vertebral body is enormous, and that's because it's got to support all the weight of everything above it. When we had the neck region, we only had to support the head. By the time we get down to the lumbar area, we got to we got to support not just the head, but the chest and the arms and everything else as well. So that is the vertebral body. Don't forget we still have a vertebral foramen, which is the hole where the spinal cord goes. That hole is also quite large down in the lumbar region as well. One of the most noticeable features of the lumbar area, though, are how thick and big the transverse processes are. Transverse means sticking out the side, process means bump, and they are quite large here. We also, in this image, can quite nicely see the superior facets. Here, let me change colors, make them green. This is a superior facet here, and another one here. There would be an inferior facet on the flip side of this vertebrae. Concerning the facets, this is called a facet joint through here, and it's where the inferior facet of one vertebrae rubs against the superior facet of another vertebrae. And every single vertebrae has this. So the joint is in red. The inferior facet of one vertebrae is in blue there, and the superior facet of the other is in green. Now, if we continued, there'd be a superior facet on this vertebrae, and then on this lower vertebrae, there'd be another inferior facet, and this would come with another joint here, and it would come with another series of superior and inferior facets on both. So this thing repeats itself at every vertebral joint. Here we have an image of the sacrum and the coccyx. As mentioned earlier, the sacrum is comprised of 5 separate sacral vertebrae that fuse into one object. Here you can see a dividing point between sacral vertebrae number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. So we have number 1 here and number 5 down here at the bottom. This whole thing down here is the coccyx, and you'll see that it is, in this plastic model, it is built in such a way that it's fused onto the sacrum. In reality, there is a little bit of a flex there. I like it better in this image, how it's shown as a separate thing, which is true in most humans. You'll notice here that it's comprised of 1, 2, 3 pieces, whereas in this one there are 4 chunks to it. And that's typical. We can have anywhere from like 3 to 7 of these things. You get many more than that, and you'll have a visible tail sticking out the rear end of the person. In most animals, the sacrum is extremely long and is going to be comprised of an actual tail. The other couple things that you can see in this image are what are referred to as the sacral canal. The sacral canal is a canal that starts here and ends here. The sacral hiatus is the end of that canal, and it's where the very bottom of the sacrum pokes out the bottom of the body. The median sacral crest is this ridge of things here. It's actually the spinous processes kind of all fused into one thing. And that basically covers our entire spinal cord. Hope you enjoyed. I did want to tack on one last thing here. This is showing how various spinal curvatures develop. When you're born in the fetal position, you have one thing called a primary curvature. As you learn to crawl, you develop a secondary curvature in your neck, and by the time you're able to get yourself up and walk, you've got a secondary curve in the cervical region and one in the lumbar region. So those are both secondary, and you have a primary curve in both the sacrum and in the thoracic region. And this basically allows people to stand upright and have balance to walk. In something like a rabbit, there's one secondary curve in the neck and one primary curve for the rest of the body, and that's true of all 4-legged critters.